Alex, thank you very much for joining me today. I've been looking forward to this one for quite a while, actually. So, there has never been a really profitable bioplastics company before, and you intend to be one inside the next 12 months. So, my first question for you is why is an entire industry that the world obviously needs just allergic to making money?
I think all of us in sustainability would like to make money, right? But I think that overall there was a kind of a socio-political movement to get green starting in the 90s. And what you sort of see there is, the market was doing well, people were flush with cash. And we're open to creating things that weren't necessarily profitable. And in doing so, they inadvertently created a model of non-profitability, right? So with the intent of being profitable, right? So there was a lot of government support. There was a lot of investor support. There was patience and time for these businesses to try and develop themselves. And speaking about my industry specifically, bioplastics were first put onto the market, around 1993, 1995, that area, right? So everything was going super well. And it didn't really matter that those plastics were substantially more expensive than what they were attempting to replace. People wanted to feel good about what they were consuming. So those folks got a little bit of traction. But the reality is, I mean, we all know what happened after that. Financial crisis after financial crisis, after war after financial crisis. The model is stuck around massive capital investment to take a flyer, essentially, on whether or not something's going to work. I'll just give an example. And I hate picking on these guys, but I do it every single time I show up in public. They're just easy to punch. But, Danimer Scientific, perfect example of the problems in this industry. Some of them will say it was bad debt that took them down, but bad debt shouldn't take down a company that has raised over $500 million, and most of that in equity. And about $69 million of that was U.S. taxpayer dollars as well. Right. So we had government support, we had banking support, we had investor support, we had some very charismatic founders who should have been able to turn that kind of money into a profitable bioplastics business, but they didn't. And they went bankrupt last May, right? After about 11 years in operation. I don't know how you blow through $500 million in 11 years, but I have some suspicions, and I'm happy to go into the kind of the model that in particular manufacturing sustainability is stuck in and continues to be unprofitable. But that's really it, right? Is that the source of the allergy to profit is it's a structural problem.
Yeah, please go into the kind of what you think that structural problem is that you just alluded
Certainly.
to.
Certainly. So speaking about my industry particularly, I mean, I would love to be able to discourse on nuclear or other, sustainable energies and whatnot. It's just not it's not my domain. So I'm going to stick with materials. The first problem, and this is going to upset some people, so prepare yourself for angry comments, but scientific leadership is not business leadership. Scientific leadership is highly important to our industry. We cannot do any of what we do without the leadership of scientists. However, in my experience, and I think the record shows that scientists don't typically make good business leaders, right? There are so many other skills that you have to have. And science is extraordinarily specialized, right? You need to have charisma. You need to be able to raise funding. You need to be able to sell product. You need to be able to financially model. You need to be able to understand your market and customers. And often that is not the case with scientific leaders, right? However, who else should get the benefits from something the scientists invented, right? In a fair world, the scientists would create something awesome that the world needs. People would pay them for it. Everybody goes home happy. But that's just not how it happens. One of the problems, the biggest structural problem that should underpin everything else I'm about to say, is that plastic is the most important invention of humankind. It is the most important. Look around you right now. There are nearly everything around you right now is durable plastic. If you're listening to this, nearly everything around you is durable plastic. Your computer's plastic. The headphones you're listening to on this are plastic. Your car is 90% plastic by volume. Your house is about half plastic, right? So there's just so much around you that you don't really even realize you're interacting with plastic. I mean, I would bet, I mean, your shirt looks nice, so maybe it's not plastic, but mine is, so, it's one of the most important things ever. And as far as products go, it is the most important invention ever. And one of the reasons it's so important is because it's extremely inexpensive. What we're talking about is between 50 and 80 cents a pound, and you can make most of the modern miracles that you see every day, right? I mean, particularly if you're in medicine. I was just in a doctor's office earlier this week. Basically everything was plastic, all of it. From the mask the doctor was wearing to the needles they used to the handles of their tools to all of their equipment to everything sterile, all of it's plastic, right? For 60 cents a pound, for 50 cents a pound. That's amazing, right? It is the cheapest, most useful invention of mankind. So that needs to underpin the understanding of everything I say now. So back to the science leaders. One of the big things about science is that you have to apply for grants to get funding to keep doing science, right? But say you've done all that, right? You've brought in your grants, you've studied in the university, you have created your product with the help of the university. You've now licensed your technology from the university. They get a little piece of whatever you create afterwards, right? Now you get to go out into the big wide world of capitalism. And what happens, right? There are still grants available for early stage companies. So science leaders who are already in the grant writing motion typically go after those grants, which can be helpful, right? There's a particular type of grant that for some reason, materials founders are just drawn like flies to honey to, which is also incredibly destructive to their business. These are called economic development grants, right? And what they require is that you place your corporation, your physical entity, your factory, your employees in a particular geo, right? You have to put them in a region. That region's the one that's giving you the money, right? I've been pitched by these people probably like 10 or 15 times. And here's the thing. They're not bad people. These are good grant programs. They just don't fit sustainable materials. And I'm about to say why. So essentially, they'll give you the money, and the offer is extremely attractive. They offer to help pay for your factory. Sometimes they'll offer the first year of salaries for anyone who works in your factory. They'll give you tax breaks for the first 1 or 2 years that you're in operation in their region, right? It's incredible, right? You're getting rid of a lot of cap. You're getting rid of a lot of taxes. You're getting your OPEX paid for at least slightly when it comes to the salaries of your people. What's to say no, right? But here's the problem. Your customers aren't in that region. And when you're making a physical product, transportation is important. So you listen to the economic development grant people from rural Canada, right? You go build your bioplastics factory in your rural Canada. You're really close to your feedstocks, right? Because you're in a rural area, you use bio-based feedstocks. Awesome. Everything is working except when it's time to sell to the customer, which is, the point of a business. So when it comes time to sell to the customer, if they're not in your region, there are transportation fees. Remember that 50 cents a pound thing. I mean, how much do we think it costs to ship items? So 50 cents a pound is a pretty good deal on shipping, right? So all of a sudden your 50-cent plastic, if it was 50 cents to begin with, becomes $1 a pound. How are you able to compete with people selling at 50 cents a pound? You can't. Right. But this is only the first in a list of about 5 problems. And if you'll permit the monologue, I'll just keep going on those. Awesome. All right. So number 2, after scientific leadership, it is going to be the price, right? And I would have said this first, but it flows into all of the other problems here, right? The average bioplastic costs about $1.20 a pound. And remember, we're competing with 50 to 80 cents a pound. In the 90s, when everybody had money and everybody was willing to, pay a little more to get a little bit more sustainable, this was okay. You were never going to enter Asia with that kind of pricing, but you could mess around in the West. There are people who will buy water bottles made out of cork and unicorn tears because it makes them feel good to do so. But that is not the world, right? The West is a very small percentage of the global population, and most people around the world do not have the luxury of financial choice when it comes to what they buy. They have to buy what's offered. Often there's only really one thing offered, but if there's 2 things offered, they must go for the cheaper option because they have to put food on the table with that extra cash. So to go and say, well, Indians are very, they pollute a bunch. It's like, well, actually, they don't really have a choice.
Choice. Yeah.
Exactly. The plastics that are offered to them are the plastics that are offered to them. They don't have the wealth of choice that we have in the West, right? Nor do they have the luxury of choosing a more expensive item to make themselves feel good, right? So you have to realize that between 60 and 70% of all durable plastic is first consumed in Asia to make the knickknacks that are around you every day, right? And so that pelletized plastic, what looks like this, right, goes to India and goes to China and is made into the things that you use every day there, right? Those businesses that create those injection molded products are typically family owned to mid-sized businesses. These aren't massive globe spanning corporations. People are people who own them, not investors. And they use the money from their factory to send their kids to school, to put food on the table, right? To reinvest in their community. These are not wealthy men by and large, right? So when you go to them and you say, I need you to pay double, there's not going to be a positive answer, right? Uh, and so that's really been the reaction. And when we talk about the failure of the bioplastics market, what we're talking about is less than 1% of the global plastics market today, after 33 years of bioplastic development, is bioplastic. There's no nice way to put that. That is a pathetic failure. And the biggest reason for that is that Asia is untouched largely by these bioplastics initiatives, even though they really care about sustainability. It's a price thing. Right. And so nearly every other bioplastic company is competing solely in the West. So if you're thinking about starting a bioplastics company, I mean, firstly, don't. But secondly, if you do, base yourself in Asia so that you're not scrabbling with the other 50 founders in the West for this tiny slice of market, the feel-good market share, essentially. Right. You need, if you want to change the world, right? Like if you're looking to make money, feel free to start up in the West. Maybe you've got a slightly better product than everybody else. Maybe you'll make money. Right. But if you're trying to solve the plastic problem, you must be competitive in Asia. There is no other way. Right. So price is number two. Number three also relates to the physical establishment of factories. Which, as I mentioned earlier, is a major strategic negative for you, particularly if you put it in the wrong place. One of the things that we did when we started Applied Bioplastics is we polled our potential customers, people we were interested in switching over to bioplastics. We called them, we got meetings with their leaderships. We said, look, there's nothing that we want to sell you right now. We're like an extremely, extremely early stage startup. We don't even have product yet. But we have one really critical question that we need answered before we build our company, which is, you've been offered bioplastics for 30 years and you've never begun to consume them. Why? Right? And the rest of these reasons are going to be the exact reasons that, and if you're a bioplastics founder, this is the part you got to listen to, right? So you don't have to do the same work that I already did, 8 years ago, which is here's the reasons why big corporations don't buy bioplastics. The first one has to do with your factory. If I'm, say, L'Oreal, for example, and I make 10,000 lipstick caps per hour, right? I need to know that the plastic that's coming in to make those lipstick caps is always going to come in. My manufacturing line is extremely expensive to maintain. It's also extremely expensive when it has downtime, right? So if you are single sourcing your plastics, you have supply chain risk, you have potential downtime, right? That is unacceptable to large corporates. So when you go establish your pilot facility, you've just basically made yourself unbuyable to every major corporation on earth because you're now a supply chain risk, right? Number two on that. So price was obviously the first thing they said. Second thing they said was single source risk. Third thing is consistency. Now, plastic is plastic, right? You make it out of oil. It's the same every time. Chemical structure, same every time. When you're making things with bio-based materials, there is at least a perception amongst these big corporates that your bio-based materials may shift over time, that they will not get consistent product. And this is an okay worry. I mean, it's a little uninformed. There are plenty of processes today that can make consistent bioplastics. However, that is the perception, is that you have to fight. And this is more of a marketing problem than a structure problem. But moving on from that, you've got their processing temperature, right? And this may seem esoteric, this may seem in the weeds, but it's actually one of the most important things that prevents companies from acquiring and using bioplastics. So let's go back to L'Oreal as our example today, and say, okay, we're making the 10,000 lipstick caps per hour. That is done with polypropylene, right? Let's just use polypropylene as an example. The melting temperature for polypropylene at ideal flow, which means that it fills the molds properly and there's no defects or anything else like that, is 210 degrees Celsius. The highest processing temperature for any bioplastic on the market, except mine, is 160 degrees Celsius. So what happens when you cut your processing temperature by a third? Well, the plastic doesn't flow as well. Just like oil, because plastic is oil-based, it flows faster when it's hotter, right? So it's called a melt flow rate for anyone who's curious. But essentially, if you turn down the machine temperature so that you don't burn the bioplastic, you also have to turn down the speed of manufacturing for the entire production line, right? This is unacceptable. This is disqualifying. They're not going to do that for you, right? It's just, they've spent millions, sometimes billions on their production line. They have spent millions, sometimes billions on training their staff to do things a certain way. And you're coming in saying, hey, I need you to pay more, take on additional supply chain risk, and produce less product. But hey, you'll be sustainable, arguably, right? And I can go on a long screed about how many bioplastics are not more sustainable than what they replace. But, for a maybe being more sustainable, you must change your entire business, produce less product, and make less money on every single product you sell. An attractive proposition, is it not? Right? So there's ways to fix these things, right? There's chemical ways, there's business structure ways, but these are the main issues that prevent bioplastics from being adopted at scale.
There's a few things I want to dig into there then. So the first big one, and I think everyone in climate kind of deals with this, is that science leadership part. So like scientific founders, that they kind of, for lack of a nicer term, they need to get out of their own way and hand the business to people who think in revenue. So when someone is doing that, what does it force them to give up? And how do you kind of get out of your own way in that case?
Well, certainly. I think the founders that I have met who are going to be successful in this space started out not as scientists, right? For me, I started out in corporate sales, right? I did 10 years of corporate sales. I ran, for political office at one point as well. I have a degree in rhetoric, which you can probably tell because I never shut up. But the reality is that it's really tough for a founder to walk away from their baby. And even if they are walking away from just leadership, right? Like what if they just go over to the CTO position, let somebody else be CEO? That's tough. It's hard. It bruises the ego, right? But the question is, what's more important, right? Is it the financial success of your business, the actual change that you may be able to put into the world, the positive change that you may be able to put in the world, or, the business card that says CEO on it? And a lot of people make the mistake of finding the business card more important. So many, in fact, that I have only met founders that I think will be successful in this space who started out not as scientists. They employ scientists. I employ scientists, right? But it's really important because, scientists are curious by nature, and that's a great thing. And you want that on your staff as a founder, right? But they also are really curious, which means sometimes they want to go down paths that aren't relevant to the revenue or the profitability of your business, right? And it's important that there's someone there to restrain them. I'll give you an example using my company, right? So what we do, what Applied Bioplastics does in a nutshell, is combine agricultural waste with other types of plastic to make them cheaper and more functional, right? There's a lot of different ways to do that. We have over 90 formulas right now, to do a bunch of different jobs. And my scientist's job is to be curious and to keep developing new types of polymer, right? So that we can take on new types of customers and new types of verticals, right? But a lot of the time, we'll find ourselves, or not a lot of the time, sometimes we'll find ourselves with a little extra time on our hands, right? At least on the science team. And they say, well, I want to do this really cool thing. And I'm like, hey, that's really cool, but can you tie that to any sort of business outcome? No, I think it would be cool. Cool. Let's table that. Let's put that on the once we have millions of dollars, idea board, right? But like right now, we're a startup. And we can't just go spend money and do development cycles on stuff that's not going to result in profitable revenue. Another thing is, the discipline of product development. Product development and science are different things. They may be related. Sometimes one goes into the other, but they are unrelated, or they are different things, right? So when I say I need a cost reduction on this particular grade of plastic, then my science team goes and does that, right? But when we're designing a new product, and they say, well, what if we put this really expensive additive in there? That would make this plastic do this super awesome thing that maybe somebody would want one day. Cool and all, but I'm sorry, that formula goes in the trash. The reason the formula goes in the trash is because it takes the development of the product down a non-profitable direction, right? Down a line where we're going to end up in that same place where everybody else is, trying to convince customers to pay 50% more for something that does something really cool, which cool, it does something really cool, but is it going to change the world? If not, then if it's not going to produce revenue either, then why are we doing this? Right. So a scientific leader is going to say, hey, man, that's really cool. Let's see where it goes. And then they waste dev cycles and they waste the extremely limited capital that material startups get access to. I mean, we can talk about fundraising all day. It's very difficult in this industry, particularly when AI is sucking up 91% of all investment dollars over the past 12 months. And every single other industry in the world is fighting for that remaining 9%. It's tough. It's real tough to go get that funding. So when you spend it on things that you're curious about rather than things that produce revenue, you end up in a trap of your own making. So giving up that curiosity for a scientific founder, giving up that ability to just go do good science, right? The highest and best value for a scientist is doing good science, right? Finding things out, but it doesn't help you in business. And that's really the thing, the ego and the curiosity. And I got to tell you, man, I mean, think about trying to give up your curiosity, right? And it's really hard for others too. So I think that in general, the ones that may be successful are started by non-scientists who employ scientists.
Something that got me thinking there was around how, like, too often people build a product and then try and hunt for a market for it. And it
That's
sounds like
exactly
that's the same issue.
It's exactly right. It starts in the university, right? Like they have a theory or they have a
Yeah.
hypothesis. They test it and they're right. Oh my God, they created a product that does a thing, right? Now, because they have an exciting sounding product, they will go out to the early stage investors who, no offense to early stage investors, are usually a little bit less sophisticated than later stage investors, right? So they hear cool plastic that does cool thing. You know, if scaled to half the market, it could really make a difference. Except it's never going to scale to half the market, right? Because the first thing wasn't done first. The first thing is what we did, which was go talk to the customers and ask them what is required for them to consume your product, and then go build that, right?
There's a second level to that I think a lot of sustainability founders, climate founders have issues with, is like they believe the mission should be enough to win.
It's
Where do you
never.
think that line is between no, it, and where do you think that line is between like mission driven and I guess commercially naive?
It's all commercially naive to me. I think that, you know, the people who tout the success in the West of bioplastics, which is still not a success by my definitions, but hey, there are people selling product, right? Are blinded to the fact that there is a much larger world out there, right? If you say that you're mission driven, yet your products are confined to the West, no, you're not. No, you're not. Yeah, there's 7 billion other people on this planet that aren't in the West, right? And they need plastic too. And if they can't consume yours, you're missing 7/8 of the market. You're missing 7/8 of the impact that you could make. So to kind of wrap this up in a nutshell, say you have a plastic that is made out of air and degrades into air and does a perfect job the entire time, except it's $2 a pound, right? I'm sorry, you have a world-changing plastic if it costs 75% less, right? That's it. It's just, you're not going to get to change anything. You are going to get to win some awards, you know, have some people say nice things about you, maybe make a little bit of money in the short term until somebody with something slightly better, slightly cheaper comes along, and then you lose those few customers you managed to bring in too. It's pretty bleak, right? So you can be mission driven and you should be mission driven, right? Like, I mean, not to pat myself on the back or anything, but my last year in corporate sales, I made $1.7 million, right? And most of that was commissions. I was very, very good at what I did. But at the same time, I spent 10 years doing that. And my greatest accomplishment was closing a really big deal that made my CEO 2% richer, right? And I didn't think I could spend the rest of my life doing that, right? And I had some cash, obviously, from being good at sales. And so I wanted to do something important. But at its base, or at my base, I'm a sales rep, right? So the way I think is about the customer, about solving the customer's problem, about finding out what is going to make them happy to spend money, not begrudgingly, happy to spend money? What is going to make them feel like my partner, right? What is going to make them feel like Alex is going to take care of me? He cares about my needs. And the very first step of that is to ask them what they need, right? You can't find it out otherwise. And so if you do not do the first step first, which is understanding your market, you have a cool science project. That's it.
You've said before that you think most climate companies are addicted to outside capital instead of revenue. And I think that's kind of another symptom of the whole like scientific based as opposed to revenue based, because you get university grants. So it feels like the typical next step is get grant funding in the market. How do you spot a founder optimizing for the next raise instead of the next customer?
That's actually not the question that I can answer because I'm not an investor, right? I don't know how to spot them. But when I'm talking to my
Have you suffered from that yourself?
personally, well, that's a little bit of a different story. We have never closed a formal round of funding in 7 years. We've raised $3.2 million in that time, which is not very much. It may be me. It may be that I have some very, very strong opinions about how to do this and particularly not how to do this. However, we're constantly raising because of that, right? We have to go for outside capital because we're not yet profitable. Thankfully, that's coming to an end. Like you mentioned, either later this year or early next year, we will be overall profitable, making us the first independent bioplastics company to reach overall profitability. That said, the way that I have seen founders, I mean, there's really one thing that they'll say to you, which is, I need funding to build a factory, right? I need funding to build a factory tells you that they don't understand their market. It just does. All right. Like if the word isn't 10 factories, then they don't understand their market because they don't understand the supply chain risk that they represent. If they're talking about building a factory anywhere besides Asia, they are clearly a funding chaser because they don't understand their market. Right. So that sentence tells you a whole lot about a materials founder and whether or not they're going to be successful.
So let's dig into that a little bit then, because you mentioned earlier about the processing temperature and all that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So you refuse to make customers rip out their kit for proprietary hardware. And you've mentioned now how much winning is just removing reasons for the buyer to say no. What is the most expensive small bit of friction you've ever removed?
Oh gosh. I mean, retooling is insanely expensive because it's not just the machines, it's the people, right? These factories aren't automated. They run with human beings who have to be trained on machines. And often, I mean, I'll give an example. I went to a razor company. I don't want to say which one, as I can't remember if I have an NDA or not, but I went to a razor company, and this was back when we thought that we could maybe convince people to slightly change their processing temperature. We were wrong. And we, had to put a lot of R&D and focus into raising that temperature until it was the standard. But at the time, we visited this factory and we spoke with the people who worked on the factory floor and asked about the effects of changing the processing temperature. One of the guys there had been there for about 18 years, and he said, I would quit. And I was like, why? Over a processing temperature? He's like, you don't understand the knock-on effects. You don't understand how much that changes inside of our factory. My skill set that I have built over the last 18 years on operating these machines the way that they're operated today would be useless. You might as well just hire a new guy, right? So that's probably like processing temperature is probably the biggest barrier to adoption on durable bioplastics in particular.
I want to talk a little bit about that proprietary part as well. So last time we spoke, you mentioned how one of the biggest problems, not just in bioplastics, but in general, like climate hard tech, is people building proprietary pieces of equipment that people have to install, or proprietary factories that
Yeah.
they then can't sell. If they go bankrupt, there's no one else that can use that equipment. And so it's just wasted. What do you think is a better way of doing business when it comes to climate hard tech?
Certainly. I do want to go a little bit into why that's such a big problem, the proprietary equipment. I'll
Yeah,
use another
please.
company. I'm not going to name them as usual here, but they are partially owned by a local turnaround studio. here in Austin, right? And what this turnaround studio does is find companies with distressed assets, tries to turn them around, and if they fail to turn them around, they sell off the assets. Now, in most businesses, that's perfect. That's a perfectly fine business model. But when it comes to sustainable materials, we recently got a call. One of their portfolio companies was going under and they were offering equipment for sale. None of it was useful to a standard plastic maker. None of it was useful to a plastic maker that makes product for the general plastic industry, whether or not it was standard plastics, right? Now, there are some commonalities, right? Like if you're going to do hydrolysis or pyrolysis, you can sell your digester if you go bankrupt. They're fairly standard, right? But there's also a lot of other custom pieces that go onto that. If you have a proprietary process, you've bolted on a bunch of stuff to that digester, and now it is largely unsaleable, right? If you've modified it, nobody else can use it. So the big problem that this creates is, funding is done in a systematic way, right? You're supposed to raise at a lower valuation at the beginning, and then you gradually raise your valuation as your company makes progress. People invest as you go. Now, what happens when you go out for your, say, second round? You just got out of R&D, you're ready to start your pilot facility. You go out to a bank, you go out to an investor, and you say, I need you to build me this facility. And hey, great news. If I fail, if you're wrong about my company and I fail, well, there's land, there's a factory, and there's equipment to sell to, de-risk your investment. And partially, there's fault on both sides here. The founder for presenting this as fungible equipment, right? As equipment, as an asset, because it is not one, right? It is a purely custom machine that nobody else can use. So it should not be on your books as an asset. So there's a little bit of fraud, but on the other side is incompetence. Investors and bankers see this hard asset, assume it's like any other hard asset, and fund it, right? Now, hey, props to the founder. They got a bunch of money for a lower valuation or a higher valuation than they probably should have gotten. Everything's all happy and healthy, right? You got your factory, except, oops, sorry. As I mentioned, early stage investors are less sophisticated than later stage investors. So you get to your next round, you're struggling a little bit for obvious reasons. And you go to the next round and you say, hey guys, I need more money to keep doing more things, maybe even buy another factory. And what can happen at that point is the banks and the investors say, hey, wait a minute. What you have is not saleable. What you have is not an asset. I'm sorry. We need to devalue your company substantially, right? In order to have a fair valuation for us. I don't know if you're a founder and you're listening to this and you've tried to raise a down round before, it's really, really hard. If you're not a founder or you're planning on becoming a founder, let me tell you, raising a down round is really, really hard, right? You can't rely on any of your previous investors, right? They're mad at you for taking a down round. They may be even so mad that they'll sue you over defrauding them about your equipment in the first place, right? So it ends up being a financial problem that prevents the growth of your company just because you weren't honest about your machines. And I don't think this is intentional dishonesty, by the way. I think that most people think that their assets are assets, right? But just because it looks and feels like an asset doesn't mean that it's actually valuable. So that's a really big thing that we run into. So this doesn't work for every type of business. This doesn't work for every single business. However, our approach, and I think the approach that is lowest risk and highest reward, is screw the factory, screw the equipment, find a contract manufacturer. And I know that might sound hard if you have custom chemistry, this, that, and the other, but you could try and see if you can edit your IP so that it works in standard machines. And that's what we've done here at Applied Bioplastics. We focused very heavily because we spoke to the customers and because they told us that supply chain risk was one of the biggest things on the minds of their procurement team, the people who would write me the check for my product, right? And we said, well, what if we could make our product in the standard machinery that already exists today? And we managed it. We managed to compound our plastics in the standard twin screw extruder machine, which means, and there's thousands of these around the world, thousands of companies that own extruder machines, tens of thousands of extruder machines on the planet. Every single one of those could be making my product today. All of them. right? And so what supply chain risk? I have 50 factories in your region that could make your product for you, right? You need more? I can go get more, right? So you eliminate supply chain risk by doing that. Another thing you eliminate is the need for a gigantic amount of capital expenditure. Theoretically, this should make you more interesting to investors, right? Spend less of your money to make more. What we've found largely is that it makes us less attractive to investors because they're stuck on that physical assets thing. There's basically two classes of investors for materials. There's the green purists who only really care about the environment, only care about the mission, really don't care about the practicality. Often they are funded by, nonprofit organizations, large family funds. They're there to feel good. They are not necessarily there to make money, right? And you can get funding from those guys. But if you go up the chain, you are talking to major banks and major infrastructure investors that won't even look at you unless you're asking for $50 million or more, right? So there's this giant gap between idealistic, feel-good firms and the super hard tech, experienced firms that are accustomed to providing funding to build a nuclear reactor, right? In the middle there's nothing, basically nothing, right? And I think this is the core of our fundraising challenges is that we aren't interested in the purist narrative, and this may upset some people. I'll talk about why in a minute here. And we will never need the type of capital that the really big nuclear reactor investors are willing to provide, right? So if I go to the second group and say, hey, I need $5 million to reach profitability, they say, put another zero on that and we'll maybe consider you. It's still kind of a small deal for us, right? You go to the first set of investors and you say, I need $5 million to reach profitability. And they say, oh God, that's like, an order of magnitude larger than the checks we write. Oops. Now you're in the valley of death. And that's where I have lived. I have lived in the valley of death for 7 years now. And it's not fun, I'll tell you that. We've nearly gone out of business like 9 times. But, on the other hand, last year we moved 185,000 pounds of plastic. It's one of the highest volumes in the entire independent bioplastics industry. We made an insane profit margin, which I won't share, but it is the highest in the industry by an order of magnitude. And we have spent $0 in CapEx because we focused on drop it, make it work in what exists today. And more than that, because we have such a high margin, because we've created such a high margin with our focus on economic sustainability, not just environmental sustainability, is that we're able to share. We can share with our partners. Typically, plastic compounders make between 2 and 4% margins. We can usually double those when we partner with a compounder. So the pitch to them is, hey guys, I can double your profit margin without retooling. All you have to do is switch inputs. You can keep the same customers. They'll still be interested in the same product, but you get to make double the money. And remember who these people are. We talked about it earlier, right? They are small to medium-sized business owners. They put food on the table with their business. Imagine you just make double the money, Chris, that you make doing what you do now, and you change nothing. Like, why would you say no to that? You wouldn't.
The whole IP thing is almost it. I would think it would make you more attractive because just like with SaaS or something like that, if you have a product that can almost be just kind of scaled up and multiplied, that can make a lot more money a lot quicker. I've never heard it put that way, and I find that really interesting, actually.
I think the problem you've identified just now is the one I mentioned right at the beginning of the call, which is that for 33 years, things have been done in only one way, right? So not only does the capital stack not exist for the business model that I'm describing, it also, when you manage to get someone interested in looking at you who has previously invested in materials, most of the time what I've found is that they don't understand the opportunity because it's alien to them. It is absolutely divorced from what they are accustomed to, particularly the experienced investors in this space.
What is one decision you've made building Applied Bioplastics that you regret?
It's the timing of our funding rounds. I've made a couple bad hires. I have had to terminate 4 people's employment. Really, really hate doing that, but those aren't mistakes, right? As a founder, as a business owner, you're always going to hire people, right? And some of those aren't going to work out. It's impossible to have a perfect interview process, right? So I will say another stat that I'm super proud of. We have had 0 resignations in 7 years. People really like working here. They get the mission. We also treat them well, and I think have a unique way of managing employees that makes them want to stick around. That said, however, the biggest mistake we have made repeatedly, which is the poor timing of financing rounds. We started this business 6 months before COVID, went out for our first funding round about 10 days before COVID broke out globally. That was a disaster. We did not raise very much money. A couple years later, in 2020, it was 22 or 23, we attempted a crowdfunding round. We spent about $30,000 advertising it. We're oversubscribed on the round, and then crypto crashed. Our tentpole fund, who had taken half of the allocation for that round, went to zero. They had to pull out of the round. And when they pulled out of the round, nearly all of the retail investors also pulled out of the round. So we ended up spending $30,000 to bring in $20,000 on that crowdfund raise. We did try to run around in 2024, in late 2024. Unfortunately, Donald Trump was reelected and everybody shut down investing for about 4 months. And so we had, I think we closed a partial round then too. And then, just this spring, we were in the very beginnings of a round. We had started diligence with a number of firms in November, December of last year. And we had 5 that had gotten through the majority of their diligence, were getting ready to write checks. One of them did for $250,000. Shout out Snowcap VC. We love you. Thank you very much for your belief. But the other 4 waited just a little bit longer than Snowcap did. And within the 12-hour delay between that check coming and the others, Trump launched missiles at Iran and vastly disrupted the oil and gas economy, which has a knock-on effect on the plastics economy. Now, for us, this isn't a problem. We have highly localized distributed production. Our sales dropped by about 20% month over month when the war started. Every other plastic business saw like a 90% drop in revenue because people were pausing production. So long story short here, time your rounds better. Hey, as I've mentioned, we've been on a shoestring for a very, very long time. We typically have 1 to 4 months in runway to operate. We have been operating in that way for 7 years. It has been the most stressful thing I have ever done. It has rapidly aged me. So yeah, time your funding. Obviously a lot of these things are black swan events that couldn't have been foreseen. However, I think we could have done a better job on timing and on possibly even presentation of the opportunity to investors. Everything else is working though.
Alex, last question for you before we finish up. A brilliant founder is listening right now. Could be business, could be scientist. Pre-profit, doing everything themselves. They're sure the tech's going to speak for itself. What's one thing you tell them to do tomorrow morning?
That's a tough one. Well, first, stop believing that the product is going to speak for itself. Everybody makes the same big environmental claims you do. It's not. It won't. So learn how to market is probably the biggest one. Learn how to differentiate yourself because there's a lot of crap out there and it muddies the waters. So learn how to market. The other big thing is please do distributed production. Every time people do centralized production and lose investors' money, it makes it a lot harder for the rest of us to raise money. I mean, if one industry has burned $4 billion and has never made a profit, it's super attractive to investors to take one more bite at that apple, right? So please don't do centralized production is the big thing I would tell you to do tomorrow morning. If that's your plan, change it.
Rip out everything and rebuild it.
Yep. Please.
Alex, really appreciate your time today. It's been a great decision. It's been a great chat to have with you. Anything else you want to leave people on? Do you want to talk about Applied Bioplastics, how people can
Sure.
find out more about it, get involved?
Just super quickly, yeah. Find us on LinkedIn. That is our primary presence. I'm Alex Blum. Feel free to look me up, shoot me a message if you listen to this. Tell me your takeaways. Other than that, appliedbioplastics.com. Last thought here on what we do, right? So, we're making all different categories of durable plastics from automotive to gardening, right? We are growing. We are looking for investors. So if you are an investor and you've heard this and this makes sense to you, please do reach out. I don't bite usually. And lastly, I do want to talk about one other thing that we do that I think is really cool and should be inspiring to others. We were talking about mission versus commercial earlier, and I just kind of want to round that out. It is important that you do both. It is incredibly important that you do both. I don't think that you can exist in this world and not have a purpose other than making money. There's nothing more soul draining in your life. So what we do at Applied Bioplastics to fill our souls, despite selling toothbrushes to people who need them, is we build refugee shelters using our technology. We break even on these projects. We've never made money on them. We don't lose money on them, but it's something that we can do with our technology that takes very little time, very little money, and provides real outcomes for real human beings. So even if we never take over 10% or 50% of the plastics market with our technology, even if I don't become a billionaire and save the world all at the same time, there are roofs over heads today, hundreds of them, that we put there. So if I get hit by a bus later today, I get to go to my final rest knowing that we made a difference. And so I would encourage anybody who's doing something like this to seek ways to make real change, whether or not you succeed.
Alex, you're doing great work. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Chris.